Welcome to Beekeeping Today podcast presented by Bee Culture. Beekeeping Today podcast is your source for beekeeping news, information, and entertainment. I'm Jeff Ott.
And I'm Kim Flatham.
Hey, Jeff and Kim. Today's sponsor is Global Patties. They're a family-operated business that manufactures protein supplement patties for honeybees. It's a good time to think about honeybee nutrition. Feeding your hives protein supplement patties will ensure that they produce strong and healthy colonies by increasing brood production and overall honey flow. Now is a great time to consider what type of patty is right for your area and your honeybees. Global offers a variety of standard patties as well as custom patties to meet your needs. No matter where you are, Global is ready to serve you out of their manufacturing plants in Airdrie, Alberta, and in Butte, Montana, or from distribution depots across the continent. Visit them today at www.globalpatties.com.
We want to thank Bee Culture Magazine for continuing their presenting sponsorship of this podcast. Bee Culture has been the magazine for American beekeeping since 1873. Subscribe to Bee Culture today, and while you're there, check out Bee Culture's Beekeeping, your first 3 years, a quarterly magazine for beginning beekeepers. Hey, Kim, we survived another April Fool's Day with those giant, gentle honeybees. And last week we had the giant Asian hornets, which was a real podcast. And I'm looking forward to this week. I'm looking forward to this week's interview with Sue Cobey, Dr. Tim Lawrence, and Dr. Steve Sheppard about their new and updated Breeding Better Bees series of videos. It ought to be good.
Yeah, it'll be good to talk to all of them, actually. Sue and Tim, used to be in Ohio, down in Columbus at the university there, and worked with them quite a bit there. And Steve Sheppard used to work for me when I was running the magazine, so kind of old home week for all of us.
Well, definitely, and I'm really looking forward to this show. They have really made their mark in the bee breeding world, and they have a lot of information to share.
One of the things that... a little historic thing here is, Tim and Sue have, for 30 years, been raising New World carniolans. And they started that breeding program right when I started the magazine, and we advertised their contest in the magazine. And I remember them announcing the winner, and it was kind of cool. So they've been doing it for quite a while.
Yeah, Sue and Tim, they've all been working really hard, and it's really fun to have them coming up here on the show. So what do you think about this COVID-19 and how it's impacting the beekeeping world?
Well, I'm seeing some things come across the net that some things have changed, because if you're hauling bees, you got one guy in a truck and one guy in a car behind him.
Wow.
So, So it's, they're... And that's just smart. It's expensive, but it's smart. You don't want to share this any more than you have to.
Boy, that's the truth. It's a changed world out there. Well, on a lighter note, this week we received an audio postcard from James Wilkes. Kim, you'll remember that James joined us back in Season 1, Episode 7, to talk about HiveTracks and all the work they're doing there. But this week, his audio postcard brings us up to date to what they're doing and some future directions. Let's listen to it.
Hi, Jeff and Kim. This is James Wilkes from HiveTracks, checking in to give you an update on what we've been doing since we last talked in July of 2018. I'm coming to you right now from the mountains of North Carolina, where we are sheltering in place. In a sense, the fact that I live in the country means that I am pretty far away from other people. And given that it's springtime, the bees are waking up. My son Sullivan's bee business is booming. We've been out splitting hives and creating nukes, so we are all about bee business at the moment. While I'm inside, we are continuing to work on a lot of the things that we discussed in that podcast from 2018. So since then, we've continued to look at the data that we have within HiveTracks, and that's both on the hobbyist side and our commercial product. We've been looking at what data people are collecting, how well they're collecting it, the value of that data to them as beekeepers and to other stakeholders in the industry, and looking at new application areas, places where that data will be valuable. And along those lines, we took a trip to Rome, Italy last February, a year ago, February. So February of 2019, Joseph Cazier and myself went to Rome and made some presentations there at the FAO headquarters, along with Apimondia. And our goal there was really to present the value of bee data, pollinator data in general, to the mission of FAO and really the people that they serve, which are generally smallholder producers in the global south is the term that they use. But we see beekeeping as a great tool for economic development, which is really nothing new, but bringing technology into that space. And so we had a really good time there and helped hone some of our ideas about the value of beekeeping data to the broader community. Another thing that we've been looking at in the past year and a half or so is how can we bring value out of this data to the beekeepers? And one of the top of mind issues that we've seen bubbling up both at the local all the way to the global level is the issue of honey authentication or fake honey, traceability in honey. And we really believe that the experience that we've had with HiveTracks in collecting data at the ground level can really play a role in this conversation and in solutions. And so we are making a pivot, if you will, in a business sense, into that direction. And some of that was also born out of that trip to Rome, and that it was a topic of discussion there. And at the Apimondia conference this past fall in Montreal, there was a whole day devoted to honey adulteration, honey traceability. And that issue is one that scales from the smallest beekeeper, myself included. We have fake honey that's sold here in my hometown, right next to my honey. So it's a personal issue that I'd love to address. And then for the larger commercial keepers, we know in the U.S. in particular, it's a pressing issue with low honey prices. So that's an area we could talk a lot more about, and maybe we can in the near future. HiveTracks has an initiative that we just launched called the World Bee Count, and this is an awareness campaign to give a way for just the everyday citizen to participate in pollinator awareness for themselves and contributing to counting pollinators around the world through image collection. So that's something that you can pay attention to and look for in the coming month and a half or so during these trying times that we have. It's a great way to kind of give us an escape for us to go outside and look at pollinators and take pictures and share those around the world. So that's at beescount.org is where you can find out about that. Okay, that's it for now. Great to catch up with you. Hope to talk to you soon. Take care.
All right. Thanks, James, for that audio postcard and from all the updates from you and the folks at HiveTracks. Let's drop right into our interview with Steve, Sue, and Tim. And just before we get going, I want to let our listeners know that on the day that we recorded the interview, there was some audio glitches due to the internet, increased bandwidth and everything else. So you may hear that on Steve's line. With that stated, let's get going. Well, we want to welcome Sue Cobey, Tim Lawrence, and Steve Sheppard to the Beekeeping Today podcast. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
It's good to see you guys again.
Great.
A couple of Ohio people from my past, Tim and Sue, when they were in Columbus. Steve, of course, used to write for Bee Culture magazine when I was still there. To titles out of the way so that we've got them right. Tim is the associate professor and Island County director for extension. Sue is a WSU, I'll get that straight yet, WSUB program research associate. And Steve is a professor in the Department of Entomology at Washington State. It's good to see all of you guys again. It's been a long time.
Yeah, has been.
Yeah, great to be here, and it has been quite a while.
Yes, it has. Jeff, we're here today. Sue and Tim, of course, and Steve have a while ago put out a video on their breeding program and on their closed population breeding program, and they've updated it now, and we want to talk about that a little bit today. I've got some questions on closed breeding population programs and how they work and who can do them, and I guess we should get started. Sue, tell me a little bit about the video that you guys have put together, just why you were doing it and who's it for?
There's a lot of interest now in bee breeding since we have gotten past the arsenal of chemical controls, and I think honeybees are probably one of the most difficult animals to breed because you're dealing with a large social unit and a big population versus like trying to increase milk production in cows. So we wanted to just give the very basics of honeybee genetics, how you approach a breeding program. And I think the Page Laidlaw closed population breeding program is probably one of the most practical, easy to apply. You can start on a small scale and build it up, or you can start on a large scale and work with that. So it's very flexible and dynamic. So we wanted to go through just the basics of the basic principles of bee genetics, which are essential to understand, and then bring that to a practical how-to program.
Well, I had the opportunity to look at the video before I talked to you, so I've got some background on it, and you guys did a good job of explaining it. But what people who are there's a lot of people now who are beginning to look at producing what's called local bees, and these are adapted to the location where they happen to be living. You're in Washington, I'm in Ohio. The question is, are your Washington bees going to do well in my Ohio environment? And that's one of the things I know that you address when you're looking at environment. But tell me a little bit about how would I develop a breed of bees that was maybe less specific to Ohio than might happen otherwise? How do you get a bee that's well adapted almost everywhere, or do you?
Good question. If you look at Europe and the different subspecies, ecotypes, and how they're very keyed into a certain environment, they're always going to do better than something you introduce. But in the U.S., we have kind of a mongrelized population. In general, if you take a cold weather bee like carniolan, it's going to do better in the northern regions versus a more temperate bee, Italian bee, which will do better in the southern areas. And it depends kind of what your goal is. Do you want to produce package bees and have a very broody bee, which would be more Italian-like? Or do you want a bee that is a little more conservative and is very winter hardy, which would be carniolan? So to start off with that, say I'm in a northern climate, I would collect carniolan stock from across the U.S., as much diversity as I could get, and then start selecting within that is basically what we did, I guess, starting off. Select something that is known to do well in your particular climate. But then again, if you look at what's available commercially, it's really, a lot of it's kind of a mix, a hybrid between carniolan, Italian, just because if you buy, for example, say a carniolan queen, most likely it's mating with Italian drones because that's the more common bee in the area. So it's a bit of a mix. So just selecting out which does better in your area from that kind of a gene pool. It's about genetic diversity. Get a nice gene pool and then select out what does well. And you need some method to control the mating. That's always a difficult part of it.
I'm going to guess that that's probably the most difficult part of this, and in any breeding program, is the queen
Exactly.
goes out and there are drones from everywhere and anywhere that can be part of this program. I want to go back to in the video you had sort of the selection. What's the word I want? The things that you were selecting for in a general program, and you mentioned one of them, diversity, and then getting good traits in and trying to get bad traits out. But there were some other things that were going on that applied generally to your breeding program altogether. One of those lists, you know what I'm talking about here on this?
I think so. I mean, if you're looking at genetic diversity, if you basically just look at the brood pattern, if you have a nice solid brood pattern, you're going to have a lot of diversity in there, just the nature of it.
You also mentioned you were looking at record keeping and how that works, all of that. When I was looking at this, I was taking notes like mad, and it's still pretty complicated. I'm impressed how you guys are able to make all of this work and go in the direction that you wanted to, selecting for the bees that you want over time.
Yeah, well, it's simple and practical in that you're just pulling out the top performers every generation and propagating those. But the secret there is keeping a big enough population so you don't have losses due to inbreeding. And if you do, then you look for some other sources to bring in. But when you bring in other sources, you're kind of diluting out what you selected for. So it's really quite a balancing act. And I think the biggest tool for me was being able to control mating with instrumental insemination. You have to have an isolated mating area or some method to do that. Any breeding program needs control of mating. And that's always been super difficult with honeybees unless you...
Definitely. One of the things you mentioned was to avoid selecting for a single trait. And if I'm a beekeeper and I'm a honey producer, I'm kind of looking at I want bees that make honey, but a lot of things enter into there to allow those bees to produce a lot of honey. How do you select for...
Yeah, not to avoid selecting for a single trait, but if you look at the colony, what makes a productive colony is that suite of complexities and interactions and all those different traits, like honey production. It could be so many different aspects, egg laying rate of the queen, just all these different traits that it's hard to put your finger on. And if you select specifically for something like varroa resistance, which we've seen, you can have, or a good example is Rob Page's pollen collecting bee. You have a bee that's so focused on pollen collection. No one's bringing in honey. No one's taking care of the brood. And it collapses because you don't have that suite of traits that keeps it whole and productive. So the single trait selection, which there's been a lot of discussion with it, if it's something to seed into your population, or it's once you have developed a nice general productive population, you can start looking more specifically the bees that have those traits and increase the frequency of that trait. But you also have to keep a more holistic approach and select for productivity, which is basically all the different traits that makes the bees productive.
So if you're focusing in on something like, mite biters, and you lose focus on everything else, I don't think you're going to really accomplish your overall objective. So you want to, whatever is making the bees perform well, based on your observation, that's what you want to include in your population. And so, going back to your previous question about, selecting from within your population, that's a great idea. Bees respond to selection. And if you're able to select within your given area, then so much the better. But, the idea is that we're really trying to express here is that you're selecting from a population, not from individual colonies or bees, but within a population that you're selecting these desirable traits for in a way that is relatively pragmatic, that works well. When we were at Vaca Valley Apiaries, we ran about 400 instrumentally inseminated colonies. And they were out there in pollination, they were in honey production, they were in every aspect of it. So it's a real pragmatic way of being able to select for who's doing well, regardless of what those given characteristics might be. Hygienic behavior, great thing to test for, but should that be your only criteria? I don't think so. So I had an interesting conversation with a large Oregon beekeeper just a couple of weeks ago, and with the prices of honey, he's saying, well, maybe I don't care about honey production any longer. So, it depends on what you're particularly interested in, but bees respond very well to selection, and I think that's been demonstrated over the years through both the WSU program and through the New World Carniolan program.
Well, I like the idea of what you were doing with your 400 colonies, putting them in almonds and looking at all of the things that they go through then and then afterwards. I don't have 400 colonies. I got 4. What can I do?
If you okay. Yeah, it's hard to establish that big population. Actually, the way Page and Laidlaw set this up is the way they do in Europe, where they have several small beekeepers, each selecting within their population. Then they pull all those resources to create that big population, give them the top performing colonies back to propagate and use. So you could do it like within a beekeeping club, a beekeeping organization of some kind. So, or this way, it's okay to start small, but you have to take that outreach to create the big population over time.
I think the part of the thing you have to recognize is if you're doing it that way and you're having multiple people making evaluations, perhaps it's going to slow down your overall goals of selecting 4, as opposed to having the same people going through. When Sue and I would do it, the record keeper would always be the same record keeper. The person actually going through the colony would be the same person. So you're getting some consistency in terms of what you're looking at and how you're doing your evaluation. If you're bringing in a bunch of different people doing that evaluation, it's still going to work, but your overall objectives and goals may take longer to achieve because you have different people looking at and giving different criteria, different weight.
Well, it's like looking at different yards of bees. You're going to have variations there. You take a yard average or a small population average of that, take the best of that average, and then pull these different resources.
So when we were doing it, and what we've done subsequently is you're going through your entire population and selecting out the ones that have the criteria of temperament and pollen gathering and other characteristics that you're trying to look for, good brood viability. And then we're taking all of those colonies that we're selecting for, tagging them and moving them to a consistent honey producing yard. And that's where we would do our weight gain test. So we're selecting from within the best population, all the characteristics that we want. But then we felt that honey production, as Laidlaw used to call it, industry rather than honey production. And with using the test that we talk about that was developed by Tibor Zabel Sr. Up in Canada, is you take a weight gain test. A week later, you take a weight gain test, and that the difference in that 1 week correlates to how the colonies would do over a whole season. Is it perfect? No, but it worked pretty well for being able to, rather than doing the thing where you're trying to, these supers came from this colony and this supers come from that colony. Oh, wait a minute. Or was it that colony that, trying to do that in a honey house is just not practical. But being able to, so I got the information, I've got the data, I know which colonies I want, which ones are doing the best, and it's in a population. So if you bring in some ones that maybe had a little more drift, well, that's not going to be the end of the world because you're dealing with an entire population, not simply individual colonies.
Yeah, I think selecting for industry too, you're selecting for lots of other traits. Maybe these colonies must have lower incidence or higher resistance to pests and diseases, whatever. It's just you want to bring that in your gene pool. You don't have to do detailed tests on all these different traits. You'll never get through it. It's just pulling in what is the strongest and most productive.
From a practical standpoint, how long or how many generations does that trait last?
Yeah, it's keeping selection pressure on that population over time. If you get too comfortable, it goes back to mediocrity pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at worldwide, all these different breeding programs, they pop up, they come and go. It's just because sometimes they're too complex, or they just didn't, funding got cut, or something happened where they couldn't maintain that over time.
We were able to select for just grabbing stock that was available at the time that were Carniolan-like. Within about 3 or 4 years, had fairly consistent production in terms of quality of the queens that we were producing. So it can happen very, very quickly. But, it was just the two of us doing the selection. Again, you bring in a lot of different people with a lot of different diversity in terms of how they select. It's going to slow things down, and it may result in characteristics falling out or not being as prominent. So I think it'd be good if, Steve, you could talk a little bit about the intra colony diversity. I think that's an important concept that we're really trying to establish, that bees respond to selection, but there are certain pitfalls that you can run into that will really jeopardize what your overall objective is.
Yeah, this is Steve. I think Tim and Sue, you both mentioned it when you talked about brood viability, and honeybees being sensitive to inbreeding. It kind of relates to that intra-colonial diversity. If there's in the face of inbreeding, you get diploid drone formation and spotty brood pattern. So the gestalt of looking at the brood pattern and there are other things that can cause it to be spotty, and there are specific tests you can do to look at brood viability. But if you select for a consistently good brood pattern, then you are most likely have plenty of sex allele diversity. One of the things that we've been able to do, both with the WSU program and the New World Carniolan program, is to be able to bring in additional genetic diversity by bringing in semen from the old world. So we've been able to get a permit to bring in a semen of Carniolan bees from Slovenia and Caucasian bees from the country of Georgia, and then add that through instrumental insemination into the stocks that we're breeding for. So that's adding kind of I wouldn't say completely novel, but relatively novel germplasm, because what Sue and Tim started with the Carniolans was what was left over after 100 years or 90 years since they were first imported into the U.S. So this was kind of a new infusion of genetic diversity, but you had to maintain the selective pressure, which is what they're talking about, to keep the stock, at the level you wanted. So I think Sue and Tim can talk to that a little bit about how it's impacted the New World Carniolan stock.
Yeah, no, I think that was a huge boost, because if you look at the theoretical model of the Page Laidlaw, they give you 20 generations, and we've long passed that. We started in the 80s, and customers really noticed a boost of vigor when we started bringing in the germplasm from abroad. So it's been a huge asset to that program. And I think for the California queen producers, which we work with very closely, they really noticed a big difference in more diversity. And then customers would mention that as well. So I think it's been...
It was a big boost when we got over the political hurdle, and it was a political hurdle that restricted the importation of stock. We tried to do that in the 80s, and it just was not successful. We couldn't get beyond that political hurdle. And it wasn't until 2006 or so when the first import came in. So I think that APHIS finally saw the light in terms of needing to import stock, and the way we can do it in a way that ensures as high a degree of safety for the existing population.
At the time, they were bringing in massive numbers of packaged bees from Australia.
Yeah.
We were just still arguing for a tube of semen. So I think that opened the door.
This sounds like I'm not going to get this done in 2 summers, right? This is a long-term commitment. You guys are bringing in all of these things, maintaining all of these things, and trying to get new stuff in.
It's not so much the difficulty of it; it's the persistence.
Yeah, and sticking with it and putting a high degree of importance on it. That if you're a commercial guy, you're going to devote the resources needed in order to continually improve selection.
That's very expensive.
Yeah.
It's probably the reason somehow I got several universities to fund my program. That's why I went back into research pretty much.
Yeah, you can't, for a long time, anything with 6 legs sold. So what's the economic incentive to do any selection if I can just produce anything?
Well, also the commercial industry, they're very good at propagation, but breeding is a whole different. And I really have this problem with the queen producers call themselves bee breeders. That's a whole different realm. There's bee breeders, there's queen producers, and then on top of that, you've got the researchers giving us information how to do this.
So, and I think it's become, as there's more and more beekeepers in queen producing areas. You used to have, the Homer Parks or the Clarence Winters, or the Conans, and they had pretty much, it was their area. Well, now there's all kinds of other beekeepers moving in, so there's going to be stronger pressure to do more controlled mating and putting more emphasis on. Yeah, this is your Italian, this is your blacks or whatever you want to call them, and this is what your family heritage is in terms of your line. Well, this is a way of being able to continue to do that selection given the current situation we have with so many beekeepers now populating areas that used to be somewhat isolated, and learning how to use instrumental insemination. I mean, it is not that difficult to learn. And it can be something that's very productive and useful tool. Like I said, we literally ran 400 instrumentally inseminated colonies.
That's because we couldn't afford not to.
It was pretty much. But those colonies, I would treat them just like everybody else.
And lose them. They'd come around again a year later.
Yeah, so...
Stop putting your honey frames in cheap office tote boxes, dirty coolers, or old supers. Honey is a treasure provided by our bees. It deserves the finest treatment and protection. Made here in the U.S., the Hive Butler is designed by beekeepers for beekeeping. No more worries about slipping, sticking, gouging frames of honey. No more lost honey leaking onto the floor of your barn or your truck. The Hive Butler makes honey harvest and beekeeping cleaner, sweeter, and easier on your back. Ask your favorite bee retailer to carry Hive Butler products or order online at www.thehivebutler.com. The Hive Butler is working even when you're not.
Well, one of the things you've mentioned, and you've mentioned this several times, is looking at the brood pattern, and that's something every beekeeper does, but I look at it and what am I seeing? I mean, this is a real fundamental question in evaluating this colony, but are you counting eggs per day on the queen? How are you evaluating the brood pattern? This is just a real simple, fundamental question.
It. Just you scan a couple frames, and how solid is that brood pattern?
And what are the conditions that when you're experiencing it? You may see a spotty brood pattern, but there's a honey flow on, and so the bees are putting the honey in every cell that they possibly can.
Of course, you plug for space. That's why it's good to look at several and do that over time. I mean,
and it shouldn't take you more than a few seconds to make that determination. It's being practical. Is a pattern looking spotty? Or
same thing with temperament. You're going through these colonies, and it's kind of a comparison test. The first few kind of set the the number you're going to give them. And, you hit one that's a little bit runny or a little pissy, okay, that's going to be temperament. But I always want to go back and look at that again. Maybe a skunk was scratching on the hive or something going on there. So you're looking at these consistently over time. And it's just bee sense.
The advantage of having a lot of colonies I can see then is because I'm looking at 20 colonies in an hour or something like that, and I can see all of the brood patterns are about the same. They're all about the same number of frames, the same area on each frame, and spotty or not spotty about the same in every frame. So I can see where a lot of years of practice and a lot of years of experience are going to really be beneficial here.
Yeah.
If I'm just starting out doing this, then let me go back to this practical thing. How do I evaluate? You mentioned the spotty part of it, and you mentioned temperament too. That's a good thing. I don't want to have to drop and run every time I open up a colony. But how are you measuring these things other than? And you got 50 years experience in your combined heads there. How do you measure these if you're just beginning to look at these and say, okay, this is an A, this is a B, and this is a C colony?
Giving it a point value, and just to hold the horses a little bit, if you're a hobbyist beekeeper, and you've been keeping bees for 3 or 4 years, maybe your focus needs to be on becoming a better beekeeper, and then learning how to raise queens properly, and not trying to, we've seen, you see these little stubby queen cells, or you look in a grafting frame and you look at, and there's every age possible from what was grafted. So learning how to graft and grafting those 24-hour-old larvae and making sure they're going into colonies with lots of nurse bees. Knowing the fundamentals about queen production is critical. And as you develop your expertise and understanding, then starting to run the breeding program. If you're a hobbyist organization and you have different levels of folks, perhaps some of the more senior folks will take the lead on the breeding program. But it depends on a lot of factors. But everyone jumping in, I got my first package last year, and I want to start a breeding program this year, is probably not going to be a good.
Yeah, I get an awful lot of requests that people want to learn instrumental insemination, and they have 2 hives in the backyard, and it's like they've never done queen rearing, or what are you going to do with this? It ends up on the shelf like a trophy, which that does nobody any good.
And I think it's important that folks try and develop local bees, but they shouldn't be afraid that a lot of these queen producers have years of experience. And if you find a good, reliable one, and you have one that is doing a lot of work on improving their line of bees, you're going to do pretty good with that, buying queens from them. So, I wouldn't want to throw out all, that only local bees are the best bees. You can do fairly well with buying bees from a commercial queen producer who knows how to raise good queens and has been doing selection. And there are several of them out there.
Yeah, if I can add to that's a good point. And the other idea is if you're starting out and you're checking different queens from different producers, and you find some you like, then you get a few of those. Then that's the time to begin. Say you find a one of your colonies you think's wonderful. That's a great time to start just beginning to learn how to rear queens from that one. They'll mate in your area, and then you can see how you like them compared to the original that you started with. And you're not really, it's not a breeding program, but like Sue and Tim said, the first step's got to be learning how to rear queens. And you learn so much about the honeybee just by doing that.
I would think coming up with a really good record-keeping system would be very important as well. You can't trust everything to memory.
Yeah.
So looking at the traits that your programs are looking for, we've mentioned temperament, hygienic behavior, brood viability, industry. I like the way you use that term, industry. One of the things you haven't mentioned is color. Is there any value to looking at color?
Well, you might get some different opinions based on who answers this question. But from my perspective, the color is a relatively easy thing to select for, and it's the first thing that beekeepers see. So mainly as a marketing tool, that you're producing a nice, consistent, uniform bee is a good marketing tool. I don't see the danger in selecting for color. Others may disagree, but
Well, I think it's also an indication that things are mixed up. If you buy a carniolan, you don't want her to be yellow. Carniolans don't have yellow. They've got some striping, but it just shows that there's a mix-up in the mismating.
Well, that kind of leads to the question that if I'm purchasing queens from a particular producer, what kinds of questions am I asking those people? What are you doing in your selection process that tells me you've got a kind of a good handle on your selection process? One of the things that I often do is I tell people to do two things when they are looking at a queen producer. One of them is watch the weather, 2 weeks, 3 weeks before they buy a queen, just to make sure that you didn't have 40 days and 40 nights of rain, because that's going to be a problem. But also, how does your selection process work? How many steps do you go through, that sort of thing? What kind of questions should I be asking, do you think?
Yeah, also you might want to ask them about their drone saturation. Their drone rearing practices are really key.
Well, how many if I've got a queen breeding yard, I'm a breeder, how many drones should I have out there?
Well, what you need to do is establish those drone congregating areas, which that can be 30, 50, 20,000 drones in. And so you don't look at it so much as how many drones the queen mates with. It's more establishing these areas that's really critical for the bees, and doing drone saturation so you have that huge number of drones.
So if you're in an area with lots of beekeepers, it's really not practical to try and do that. If you can have an established area, try and put a diversity in diverse locations around. So don't just all try and put them, but maybe in a mile or two radius, put several apiaries within that area to try and increase your population. In the 10 years we were in Vacaville, we didn't have exclusive control over that area, but we had pretty good control over that area, and we got some fairly consistent matings of natural matings that had uniform in color and uniform in the characteristics that we were trying to achieve. So you do it the best you can. So and people should not. I said we ran 400 colonies, but we were doing a heavy selection process in that effort. Not every queen needs to be instrumentally inseminated, but your breeder colonies should be.
When you say set up your drone colonies, are you selecting the drones for anything specific? I thought I saw a little bit of research coming out now that they're starting to focus on the drones themselves.
Well, it's again within a population. That's one of the most important concepts that we need to get across, is that those drones are coming from the population that we're selecting from. So it's a representation of the entire genome that we're putting out there to try and do the mating with.
So basically just taking daughters from your top performing queens, and because the drones are haploid, that'll be a very pure source of drones, and choose a lot of different mothers for that too. So you have the diversity.
So when you've selected the top 30 or so colonies, you're grafting from all those 30, and you're randomly distributing that out into your population. So, but you want to make sure that you just don't graft off of one queen, or your so-called super queen. You want to have a diversity of your top producing queens out there, and then their offspring, especially the drones from that population, are a good representation of your entire population. Similarly, when you're doing the selection, you want to graft a few from each of your top lines, and you want to inseminate those with a randomized mix of semen. And the way we do that is we put all the drones in one yard. We go out there and we're assuming that there's drift within the apiary, but there's limited amount of drift between apiaries. There is some, but it's not significantly important. And so we're taking a few drones off of this colony. We use clean excluders in front of them. It's the easiest, fastest way to collect the drones. We select a few drones from this one. We move on to the next one, select a few drones. Next one, grab a few drones. And then we're putting those into, when we do the insemination, we're putting those into a drone cage, and we're just randomly picking them out. So you want to get a good diversity mix of within the entire yard. You do not want to try mechanical mixing of the semen. It causes too much damage. But you want to get a good representation of your population within those colonies that you're doing the insemination.
So if I have breeders in different yards, I take a cage of drones from each of those and mix it in my flight box, rather than the drones the sperm have really long tails and they're really fragile. So there's some mechanical. By mixing them mechanically, it damages the sperm, and you'll get a lower sperm count in the queens.
Well, it's looking more and more and more like the bigger the number of colonies that I can be selecting from, the greater the diversity and the more choices I'm going to be able to make.
Exactly. So if you have a small population, I would take of those select queens. I would take daughters from each of those and make sure you keep that integrity of that population. When the larger your population gets, you can get more random in that selection and just take the top performers. But you just kind of adjust it to what your resources are. Like if you're a club doing these subpopulations, you take some from each of the subpopulation and mix up to just simplify it to that smaller scale. Does that make sense?
Yes. That makes very good sense. Yes, exactly. I can see where a club could make this work if you had even 3 or 4, let alone 8 or 10 people in this program. So it'd be good advice if you're looking to develop a local, if you will, population. You can do it with the right number of people doing the right things. Where do I find your film? Where can I see this?
I should have written it down. It's free and available on the Vimeo address, and
we can post it.
Yeah,
we'll put the link in the show notes.
I just posted it on the New World Carniolan Facebook page as well, so it's up there independently. So, we've had, I think, almost 1,800 people watch it on the Vimeo, and in 2 or 3 days posting it on our New World Carniolan Facebook page, we had almost 400 within a couple of days. So it's getting out there, and it's being viewed by a fair number of people, and we hope it makes an important contribution to selecting. When we started this, we were, granted we had the mentor of Dr. Laidlaw and Page to kind of talk us through what we were doing, but we were a 27-year-old and a 30-year-old with no more than a bachelor's degrees, and
not much money.
And not much money at all. As our accountant said, you can make more money in a passbook account than you're making in your business right now. But, we were still able to produce what Rob Page called the industry standard for Carniolan queens within a relatively short period of time. It works. Bees respond to selection. You just got to be careful that you don't run into some of the pitfalls that Steve talked about in terms of loss of diversity.
Well, that makes good sense. I certainly recommend for anybody who's going to watch this to sit back, relax, and take good notes, because there's a lot of information that they present in this film. And then watch it again, because you'll miss a lot the first time. It's a lot of depth and a lot of good information. So what haven't we talked about on this film that you guys really want everybody to hear?
Maybe a little bit more discussion on instrumental insemination. I mean, I've always promoted that, but it is a very specialized technique, and there's a lot of specialized beekeeping that goes with it in terms of caring for the queens and the drones. Most beekeepers don't pay attention to drones. They're very perishable, the first to go if you have any stressors in the colony. So, and trying to get a large number of drones from a specific source like that can be quite a job.
And so one thing we really emphasize and put in drone comb into our colonies, either the plastic frames or comb that has a lot of natural drone comb. And so we want a good population of drones, which can increase your varroa. Does increase your varroa levels, but you can also use that to trap drones later on in the season, or trap the mites in the drone comb. So you can use it both ways in terms of keeping varroa under control by trapping them in the drone comb and pulling it out before the drones emerge, but also putting them in early so you have a large number of drones. It takes a lot of drones, just to do the insemination or to get good mating.
Well, that's the instrumental insemination part of that is certainly interesting. The film talked about it a lot and showed a little bit about it.
No, we're doing a series of 3 films. I did a insemination video back in Ohio, so we're going to redo that, update it a bit, and we're also going to do one on cryopreservation. We didn't talk about that, but these are Brandon Hopkins at WSU has been working on the improving the technique. So now that has become part of the USDA's germplasm. Honeybees have not been in there, but now they are because of that. And this opens the door for huge amount of advances in bee breeding and work like that. Steve, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
You want to talk about that a little bit, the cryopreservation?
Sure, I will. For many animals and humans, we've had instrumental insemination and cryopreservation of semen for a long time. I think it started in the 1950s in dairy cattle. But until the last few years, we haven't been able to do it with honeybees. But starting in about 2008, 2010, Brandon, while he was a graduate student, actually developed the techniques. And now it's a central part, really, of our breeding program, because these trips that we make to Europe to bring back germplasm, we're able to freeze some of that in liquid nitrogen and then bring it out, years later and use it in breeding. So, for example, last year with a certain Caucasian line that we used semen that had been frozen for 9 years. So it's not perfect as far as the queens that you inseminate with previously frozen semen don't last very long, but they last long enough for you to get to produce queens from them and to kind of recover the genetics. So that's what we're doing right now. And there's growing interest in this technique worldwide, especially for subspecies that are kind of rare or endangered or declining.
So there's going to be a series of 3 videos. One on selection and breeding, one on instrumental insemination, and then one on cryopreservation.
Well, we've got good things to look forward to then. I look forward especially to the update on the instrumental insemination video. I remember looking at that one some time ago, but sounds good. All right.
Yeah, I think I have a VHS version of it.
That day too.
But do you have a player to use it with?
I do. Yes, I do. Hey, guys, I'm going to need to get off. It's been great. Thank you.
Steve, thank you for joining us today.
No, it's been my pleasure.
Great. Well, thanks, Steve. Take care. Hey, Sue, Tim, anything else you want to add before we sign off?
We should give a shout out, our appreciation to WSU Connor's communication team that did the video work, and Sarah and the Sustainable Ag program at WSU, which helped fund this work.
Well, it was well done. Certainly did a good job of making you look good, Tim. I got to hand it to him. So, all right. Well,
very good.
Well, I'm still around. A lot of people think I just, I don't know, disappeared, but I'm still here.
Well, it's good to hear. Tim and Sue, thank you for this today. We appreciate it. I encourage people to look at your video and to learn what you can from it, and then look at it again and learn some more and take good notes. So thank you for joining us today, and good luck in the future.
I did enjoy that conversation with Sue, Steve, and Tim, and I'm looking forward to watching all their videos. I saw the first one, and I'm looking forward to the follow-ups.
Yeah, all three of them are going to be good. I know they'll be as good as the first one, and the highlights that they talked about today are, if you've got 4 colonies in the backyard and you're trying to just raise some queens, or you've got 400 colonies with artificially inseminated queens, some of the principles are basically the same, and it's good record keeping and have a good drone population. If you're a smaller operation, you got to evaluate your colonies as best you can, and it's probably a good idea to talk to some of your neighbors to see how their bees are doing compared to yours, so that what you're getting is the best that you can get from where you are. So avoid inbreeding, keep diversity in the population. Check with your queen producers this year if you're buying queens, and find out what they're doing. Are they doing some of these same things? And what's the weather like when those queens were being bred? All sorts of these things. I look forward to the next 2 films, and I really urge people to take a look at these, if nothing else, just for good basic biological information on queen breeding.
All right. Well, that about wraps it up for this podcast. Before we go, I want to encourage our listeners to rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, wherever you download and stream the show. Your vote helps other beekeepers find us quicker. In fact, while you're out there, write a review, give us 5 stars, and give us a glowing review. That would be great. And as always, we thank Bee Culture, the magazine for American beekeeping, for their sponsorship of Beekeeping Today podcast. We want to thank our regular episode sponsor, Global Patties. Check them out at www.globalpatties.com. And finally, we want to thank you, the Beekeeping Today podcast listener, for joining us on this show. Feel free to send us questions and comments to questions@beekeepingtodaypodcast.com. We'd love to hear from you. Anything else, Kim?
I think just tell everybody to be safe, be careful, and keep your distance.
Please. Thanks. Take care.